Thanks for tuning in. You're listening to A Bone to Pick. When we think of stories about humans and pigs, there are narratives we already tell ourselves. We think of Charlotte's Web or maybe nursery rhymes about piggies going to markets. We know some cultures eat a lot of pig meat and others don't. It sounds pretty simple, so what else is there to understand? Apparently a lot. I sat down with Max Price, a lecturer in archaeology and anthropology at MIT. He's an expert in zooarchaeology, and more specifically, pigs. He's been studying the long-standing relationships humans and pigs have had through early human history throughout today, specifically in the Near East. Further, Max is an expert in the material bone remain of pigs, something I'm interested in learning a little bit more about today. So in your studies, you've worked with ancient pig teeth and pig bone, and specifically their dental calculus. So can you tell us a little bit about what dental calculus is and what you can find in it?
Dental calculus is essentially mineralized plaque on teeth. It's also what's called tartar, the substance that is scraped off at the dentist's office. It's basically formed by bacterial decomposition of small and sometimes not so small food particles that adhere to teeth. When it mineralizes, it traps in a mineralized matrix tiny microscopic parts of plants, things that are called starch granules, more or less basically tiny microscopic particles of starches, and phytoliths, which are silica bodies that are found within plants. Both of these can be identified to plant species, so therefore you can get an approximation of sort of direct evidence of what animals were eating, which is very exciting. You can also do this with humans. So you get a direct indicator of diet, which is something that archaeologists are always very interested in the past. We're always trying to understand exactly what animals and people were eating. The other thing that dental calculus can provide us is genetic information that is both related to the animal specifically. So the animal's DNA or the person's DNA. This gets trapped in the matrix with through the saliva and dead skin cells that end up getting trapped in. You can imagine all kinds of things floating around in the mouth that get trapped into this matrix, and then also the bacteria that are in the mouth, both as part of a healthy oral microbiome, as well as anything that might be pathogenic. So these also can get trapped in, and they can tell us about ancient disease. They can also just tell us about the general oral microbiome of animals and people in the past.
So it's not initially apparent that ancient pig's teeth and an ancient pig bone can give us insight into an agricultural and human past. How did you come to this?
This is built on a larger body of study called zooarchaeology, which is the study of animals and how animals in the past and how they interacted with past human populations. Animals play, even just kind of cursorily thinking about it today, we play huge roles in human societies, whether they're sources of meat, which is something that humans have been craving probably since before our species evolved, but certainly meat was probably played a very important role in our evolutionary history. Whether animals are serving as pets, which is another human universal, whether they're work animals, you think of like draft oxen or horses for riding, or even just whether animals are illustrative figures, whether they're metaphors that we use to tell stories about ourselves and to understand our world. Animals are pervasive in human cultures and play a really significant role in them. So zooarchaeologists study that, and we primarily study it through the material remains of animals that were left by people. So these are bones and teeth, Occasionally you'll get lucky and find a mummy or some hair or something like that, but that's pretty rare.
What do these remains tell you about the site, and how can you fit that into the archaeological record?
This gives us a sense of what animals people were raising and in what proportions. Um, so, for example, generally in the Near East, you find a lot of sheep and goats. Those are the most common animals that you encounter. That tells you that you're in a primarily pastoral society. When certain animals start to play more important roles at certain points in time, that can suggest that there's a changing relationship. So, for example, a little more than 10,000 years ago, sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs go from being relatively rare animals in zooarchaeological assemblages in the ancient Near East to being quite common. And becoming more common. And this is one of the first ways that we know that animals were becoming domesticated. They were starting to be raised for their meat, as opposed to the hunting of animals, which up to that point had primarily been gazelles. So that's one way it can tell us. Another way is looking at, and there are really many ways it can tell us. Just highlighting a few of them. The others is looking at the measurements of bones, the dimensions of bones. So, and this is something that I've studied a lot, domestication and the process of selecting animals on an unintentional level for domestication is a long-term evolutionary process. And it has one of the selective mechanisms, and for reasons we don't entirely understand, is animals tend to get smaller, and they tend to have significant reductions, especially in their faces and in their teeth. But we can actually track the measurements of bones, looking at standardized measurements on different bones and teeth across time, and actually be able to track not only when domestication has happened, but we can also get a sense of the intensity of the selection pressures that humans are applying to animals as they're changing from these wild animals to more docile domestic animals. The other thing that I've also worked on are pathologies. Pathologies are really interesting in bones and teeth because they show us a little bit more of the personal life history of animals and humans, especially the incidence of diseases that animals may have had. You're only getting a small window into diseases because these diseases have to be ones that would actually leave an osteological signature, something that would actually imprint itself on bones and teeth. You can sometimes see injuries that the animal may have sustained in life. Sometimes these are a result of human management or interference. So, for example, pulling of cattle horns, removing the horns, which is often done to prevent injuries or to manage cattle better, is something that you can see archaeologically through the paleopathological data. And the final thing that I study to look at animal management is stable isotope analysis, which is looking at basically comparing the different ratios of certain types of stable isotopes that are found in organic molecules. So carbon and nitrogen, also oxygen and hydrogen. And these are really important because they correspond, the different ratios of these different isotopes. So, for example, the amount of carbon-13 versus carbon-12 found in animal bone tissue directly relate to the foods that animals were eating, and therefore that ultimately get incorporated into their body tissue, and therefore directly correlate to environmental features, whether it was particularly rainy, whether the climate was cold. It also relates to the choices that humans made in feeding their animals. Were they providing fodder, lots of cereal grain to their pigs or their sheep or their goats, or were they allowing them to free range. So these are all the kind of ways that we can start to get access to agricultural practices through the study of animal bones on both a very macroscopic level as well as a atomic sort of very microscopic level as well.
You have an upcoming book, so it's being released in December, and it's called The Evolution of Taboo. And so, how does everything that you've mentioned fit into your analysis on the relationship between humans and pigs? And will you be describing that in the book?
The book stems from a kind of I guess a sort of a contradict or a epiphany that I somewhat of an epiphany that I had, which was I've been through my dissertation work and on my research I've been studying pig domestication and the early uses of pigs in the ancient Middle East, from the Neolithic period, so around 10,000 years ago, all the way up to the origins of some of the earliest, really the first cities in the world in a period called the Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age, which is more or less 4,000 to 3,000, 4,000 to 2,000 BC. And pigs played really important roles in those societies. But of course, sort of coming back to the present, when you go to the Middle East, of course, you don't encounter a lot of pork. So there was this real, this kind of paradox that I kind of unintentionally ran headlong into, which is that a lot of my research was in direct contradiction to the actual experiences of life in the Middle East today. So I wanted to explore exactly how we got from this pigs being, one of the most important features of agricultural life in the region to being something that is taboo. The book combines both the zooarchaeological work that I mentioned, trying to reconstruct how humans and animals interacted in the ancient past using metrical data, using bone counts, using paleopathological data, using stable isotope data. But it also looks at how people were talking about pigs, how pigs figured into life in the ancient past viewed through the lens of ancient texts, which started appearing around 3000 BC, as well as ancient artwork. And one of the big contradictions, again, is that pigs are frequently mentioned or frequently found in bones, but they are rarely mentioned in the textual literature. As archaeologists, we are, especially when we're dealing with historical periods where there are texts written, there's definitely a desire, or maybe not a desire, there's a tendency to really kind of use the text as a guiding framework to understand the archaeological record. But the archaeological record is not written, as it were, by the same people who are writing the text. The archaeological record is a result of everyday trash, which reflects the sort of the grander notions, the sort of greater motions of society and everyday interactions of people. Texts really reflect what the people who, first of all, could write were writing about, but also, even the texts that are around today. What ultimately gets preserved are the things that are published over and over again. So it's things that have a unique appeal, especially to the elites within society. So texts really reflect a very small and narrow segment of society.
So, with all of this, does in all of your research and everything that you're finding, so does this bring up any questions that you want to investigate further, or any more important points that you want to continue to dive into with your future research?
I think one of the things that I've been really interested in lately is knowing now what I know about this contradiction between the textual record of pigs and just animal life in general, how humans and animals interact with one another. This contradiction on the one hand between texts, what's written in the texts, and what we can see actually written in the bones. We can see that clearly in the Bronze Age, but we don't actually have as good of a picture perhaps ironically, in the later periods, in the classical periods, in Greek and Roman, when Greece and Rome dominated the Middle East and much of the Mediterranean, and in the medieval periods. And, those are periods, especially, they're considered, sort of quote unquote, very historical. We have a lot of records from them. We even have writers like Pliny or Columella who are writing about how humans and animals interacted.
It looks like we are just about out of time. Max, it was wonderful to hear about your research, and thank you for sharing what you've been working on in your upcoming book. Max Price is a lecturer of archaeology and anthropology at MIT. His book, The Evolution of Taboo, is set to be released this December. I'm Haley Brown. Thank you for tuning in and learning something new on A Bone to Pick.